It's a pleasure to be able to introduce Stephen McVeigh. Steve just ended a 32-year career with the Royal Dutch Shell petroleum companies, and he's actually a Midwesterner, like many of the rest of us. He grew up and went to school in Missouri, and he spent most of his career in the United States, advancing in the Shell Oil Company to vice president of their production operations in the United States. And at the end of the 1990s, he was the CEO of a joint production operation in the Permian Basin between Shell, Amoco, and British Petroleum. And then, maybe surprisingly, he left this very comfortable existence and went for the first 4 years of this new century to one of the most remote and forbidding places on Earth, Sakhalin Island, which is a long island off the Pacific coast of Siberia. And there, Steve learned Russian and shepherded through one of the largest integrated petroleum and natural gas projects that the world has known. And that's what he's going to talk about this morning. So I give you Steve McVeigh.
Thank you, David, for that introduction. I'd also like to thank Dr. Smith and Dr. Dhanaraj for inviting me to come here today to speak to you about the importance of Russia in the world's energy future. The views that I have today are my own, based upon working my career in the Royal Dutch Shell group of companies, the last 4 of which have been in Russia. I'd like today to characterize the hydrocarbon resources in Russia and discuss that in the backdrop of growing world demand for energy. I'll also discuss some of the issues that need further resolution for Russia to fulfill its ultimate potential as a global energy supplier. And finally, I'll discuss elements of the Shell Sakhalin project, the one I have most experience with in the Russian Far East, and also demonstrate to you why this is a pathfinder project that I think is a good case study or example of unlocking Russia's oil and gas resources for the rest of the world. But before I do that, I can't help but listening to some of the earlier speakers this morning, Steve Chapman speaking about outsourcing hamburgers and Richard Smith talking about rapidly changing economies in the BRIC nations, reminds me of a humorous story I heard about the McDonald's restaurants when they opened their first restaurant in Russia in Pushkin Square right after the fall of the Soviet Union. And they were training their young employees, teenagers, on how to listen to the needs of customers and be sure that the customer is always right. And when this was proposed to one of the young boys who was working behind the counter, his response is, "Why should we care what the customers want? We have the hamburgers." Well, I will submit to you that things did change rapidly, because that McDonald's restaurant is now the largest McDonald's restaurant in the world. And if you were to go to a McDonald's restaurant in Russia now, you would see that it is a very successful enterprise, and the Russians indeed are enjoying the Big Macs. But I didn't come here today to talk to you about hamburgers. I'm going to talk to you about oil and gas. And let's talk about that in terms of the meaning as it relates to Russia. Over the next 25 years, the world's population will rise to 8 billion, nearly 2 billion more than today. The average income of those people will be double what it is today, and they will own 500 million more cars. Those are just some of the factors that mean that the world energy demand is going to grow massively in the decades ahead, increasing by 60% by 2030, according to the International Energy Agency. While oil will continue to be the dominant fuel base, global demand for natural gas will see larger growth rates at about 2.5% per year over that period. Under direction of global climate initiatives such as the Kyoto Protocol, countries will attempt to balance the energy needs of their growing economies against further deterioration in air quality in their respective regions. Clean burning and efficient natural gas transported regionally through pipelines and over great distances by ships in liquid form as LNG will provide a potential means for meeting both of those objectives. Russia's total hydrocarbon resource, taking oil and natural gas together, is the largest of any country in the world and is some 45% more than its nearest competitor, Saudi Arabia. When looking at the production growth potential of supplying other countries' energy needs over the next 25 years, Russia ranks first in oil production potential and fourth in gas production potential. Now, this considers the fact that OPEC will remain as a swing producer always with that role. About two-thirds of Russia's hydrocarbon reserves are gas, some 1,700 trillion cubic feet, which make it more than twice the reserves of the next largest country, Iran. This data shows that Russia certainly has the natural resource base to play a pivotal role in meeting the world's growing demand for energy. And one of the key areas where value can be added is the further development of Russia's gas business. Global gas demand is growing rapidly at about 2.5% a year in all the major markets, and that gives Russia huge opportunities. This global market is big enough to provide room for all parts of Russia's gas business to grow. That includes in pipeline gas, which will continue to be attractive in many locations, in LNG, where we will see a much more rapid growth in world demand at about 7 to 10% per year. And looking further ahead, there may be the possibility of Russia entering the gas to liquids business. Of course, Russia has a century-long history of supplying energy around the world. However, unlike many countries with long histories as energy suppliers, Russia is not facing the challenging of managing maturity and decline. Rather, the challenge for Russia is how to best seize new opportunities, to establish positions in new markets, and to develop reserves in challenging remote frontier regions such as western and eastern Siberia, offshore along the northern Arctic Ocean shelf, and Pacific offshore down to Sakhalin Island. All of these areas are immature, hydrocarbon-rich sedimentary basins that represent severe technical and economical challenges with the Arctic conditions and remoteness of the resource. Russia has 7 offshore shelf basins, each of which are equal to or larger than the Gulf of Mexico or the North Sea in hydrocarbon potential. Once the resource is found and developed, it has to be efficiently transported to world oil and gas markets where the demand originates. Russia's existing oil pipeline network, which is exclusively managed by the natural monopoly state company Transneft, runs at near capacity, transporting oil from the mature basins of the Volga-Ural region and western Siberia to their domestic market, as well as for export to Eastern European countries. Today, over 35% of Russia's oil exports are by rail or barge, which adds greatly to the cost and logistical challenges. Major long-distance pipelines and marine export terminals need to be built in both the East and the West to bring new reserves to markets in China, Japan, Western Europe, and North America. There is a similarly challenging story with respect to natural gas pipelines. In order to realize those opportunities, there will need to be investment across the Russian upstream energy sector on a massive scale. The International Energy Agency estimates that this could amount to more than $900 billion over the next 25 years, or an average of about $30 billion a year. And while some of that investment will come from Russian sources, international investors will have a part to play. International energy companies have become increasingly involved in areas of Russia's oil and gas business since the fall of the Soviet Union. The approaches to investing in Russia's oil and gas have been varied. In 2003, British Petroleum acquired a 50% stake in the Tumen Oil Company for a reported $6.5 billion to form the BP-TNK joint venture, which is now the third largest Russian producer and focused primarily on mature producing areas in the Ural as well as Western Siberia area. Shell, Total-Fina Elf, ExxonMobil, and Chevron Texaco have concentrated on new greenfield or grassroots growth projects versus acquisitions. And I will touch on Shell's investments later in the presentation. Last September, ConocoPhillips announced a $2 billion acquisition stake in the shares of energy giant Lukoil, Russia's largest oil company, which has now led to their holding a full 10% share in the oil giant. Despite these encouraging openings of Russia's energy resources to Western companies, the level of activity has not been consistent with the need nor the opportunity. The Russian government has been slow to grant long-term field licenses to foreign investors, and the foreign investors have been reluctant to plop down billions of dollars of investments without solid guarantees in terms of reference from the government. And the Russian federal government has recently tightened federal control over resources and insisted that new development be on traditional tax and royalty regimes. While there are some signs of recent reductions, federal tax rates on Russian production remain quite high and can discourage investment into the business. Bureaucratic regulatory permitting processes that are holdovers from the old Soviet central planning era are still not in sync with the advanced international performance-based standards of today. These prescriptive regulations bog down new projects with delays and uncertainty and provide an opportunity for exploitation by corrupt public officials. Transparency International, a German corruption watchdog group, recently ranked Russia 88th of 133 countries on their annual Corruption Perceptions Index, and on par with Algeria and Pakistan. Russian companies have obviously grown up in this environment, but international companies find it challenging to run a business in Russia while obeying the international ethic and legal norms. Shell is an example of an international company that has been successful in growing a business in Russia. Shell has a rich history in the CIS and involvement in the Azerbaijan region going back to near the end of the 19th century. To date, Shell has invested nearly $7 billion in both upstream exploration and production projects and downstream fuels and lubricants marketing businesses in Russia. Major projects include a $500 million stake in the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, which transports oil from the Tengiz field of Kazakhstan to the Black Sea port of Novorossiysk. Production began late last year in the Salim field in western Siberia, where Shell will ultimately invest up to about $1.3 billion along with its Russian JV partner. However, the largest project is in the Russian Far East, where Shell is currently spending about $8.5 million each day on the giant Sakhalin LNG project. Shell has today around 1,800 employees, 77% of which are Russians, in offices and JVs around the country, and continues to look for additional profitable business opportunities. Now let's turn our attention to the Russian Far East and see why Shell is spending all this money on a new oil and gas project on Sakhalin Island. Shell and its JV partners in the Sakhalin Energy Investment Company acquired a long-term license from the Russian government known as a Production Sharing Agreement, or PSA, in 1994 to explore for and develop two known fields in the Sea of Okhotsk about 17 kilometers off the northeast Sakhalin coast. These fields lie in about 50 meters of water depth. The first field is the Pilton-Astakoya field. It's a giant oil field with associated gas. And secondly, the Lunskoya field, a giant natural gas field with associated condensate. Together, these fields contain over 1 billion barrels of recoverable oil and 18 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Both fields were discovered in the late 1980s by Russian companies, but failed to be developed due to capital, technology, and market shortfalls. Sakhalin Island has a storied history in Russia that was first described by the famous 19th century Russian author Anton Chekhov, who documented his journeys to the region, which at that time was a Russian penal colony. In 1903, the southern half of the island was inhabited by the Japanese after their war with Russia. Later it was invaded and taken back by Russians in 1945 after the signing of the World War II armistice with Japan. The island stretches about 1,000 kilometers from north to south and up to 160 kilometers from east to west. The regional government, or oblast, was formed in 1947, including the Kuril Islands, which lie off to the east. And the major industries there are oil and gas, fishing, coal, and timber. Just over 600,000 people live on this underdeveloped island, most in poverty conditions, with about 150,000 in the southern capital city of Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk. Having lived there for 3 years myself, I would describe the landscape, environment, and climate as similar to what you would find in southern areas of Alaska. The people are hardy, hardworking, and hopeful of new economic activity to help them improve their living standards in this remote but beautiful natural environment. I used to tell people how fortunate I was, being a country boy from Missouri, to live and work on a remote Pacific island with visions of green vegetation and blue waters, somewhat like you see in the satellite photo there in the upper left. But what I did not tell them was that for about half the year, this Pacific island was almost completely surrounded by ice, as shown in the right photo. But this wide variation in climate conditions, Arctic-like winters in the north and frozen sea ice, make for a very unique challenge in developing Russia's first offshore oil and gas project. The Sakhalin II project, managed by Sakhalin Energy Investment Company, is not only the first offshore shelf Russian oil and gas project, but also the first LNG project. There you go. The first LNG project in Russia, but it's the first project to establish sale of Russian gas to markets in the Asia-Pacific Rim. The company and project partners today include Shell at 55% ownership and Japanese companies Mitsui and Mitsubishi corporations totaling 45%. There have been discussions between partners and Gazprom, the state-controlled natural gas monopoly, to take an ownership interest in the project, but nothing yet has developed fully on that. The project is developed in 2 phases, with total front-end capital investment exceeding $10 billion. And there are 3 offshore drilling and production platforms, onshore processing facilities, and 2 850-kilometer pipelines to transport the oil and gas from the north end of the island to the southern end of the island. At the southern end of the island, near the port of Korsakov, there is a 2-train LNG plant and oil export terminal that will export products year-round to the markets of the Asia-Pacific. Phase 2 production is scheduled to start up in late 2007, and production will ultimately peak at about 10 million tons per annum of LNG and a like amount of oil. The project also will involve, and currently today involves, seeking about a little over $5 billion of non-recourse project financing from international lenders, including the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Japanese Bank for International Cooperation, as well as the United States Export-Import Bank. This is the largest capital project Shell has ever undertaken in its history, and when considered on an integrated scale of oil and gas from reservoir to market, it's one of the largest projects ever attempted in the world by anyone. Sakhalin Energy has been successfully producing oil from its Phase 1 Molekpak platform into floating oil tankers since 1999 during the ice-free months of the year, and selling those markets to markets in the Far East Asia area, also to the west coast of the United States. And this experience, I think, in Phase 1 has been very valuable in trailblazing new technologies and operational methods for the Phase 2 investment that is now ongoing. The two new offshore platforms are currently under construction in Far East Russia and South Korea. The concrete gravity-based structures, which sit on the ocean floor, are the largest of their kind ever built to withstand the winter ice forces, and they're actually been constructed in a dry dock area which is just slightly north of Vladivostok, the Russian Far East port city. Each massive structure weighs over 100,000 tons, or near the equivalent mass of a modern aircraft carrier. Both structures have been floated, and now the Lunskoye platform just set sail, in fact, last week to go out and be set in the ocean. Later this summer, both structures will be deployed on the seafloor over their respective fields, and the deck structures containing the drilling and production equipment are being fabricated at Samsung Heavy Industries yards in Soji, South Korea. When complete, they will be floated out by barge in 2006 and mated with the support structures, and this will allow the drilling of the wells to occur in time for startup in 2007. Construction of the two pipelines from the north to the south of the island goes on year-round. The work is being conducted by the Russian pipeline construction giant Starstroy, who have years of experience constructing pipelines through Russia's frozen terrain. The 24-inch oil and 48-inch gas trunk pipelines from the north to the south of the island provide a backbone of infrastructure to export hydrocarbons from more than just the Sakhalin II project for many decades to come. The LNG plant and oil export terminal is being constructed on the island's southern shores near the town of Korsakov. Prime contractor is a consortium led by Japan's Chiyoda Corporation along with Russian companies to provide local construction labor and support. These are some of the largest LNG manufacturing trains ever built. The cold Sakhalin climate provides a welcome efficiency boost to help the plants to chill the natural gas to minus 160 degrees in order to liquefy it into LNG. In total, the entire construction project is about 50% complete in all various phases and on schedule for a late 2007 start. The real breakthrough that occurred that allowed the second phase of the project to move forward was in 2003 with the signing of long-term LNG sales agreements with Japanese utility companies to assure guaranteed sources of revenue as well as anchoring project financing. Given the patchy history of Japanese and Russian government relations, it was quite challenging to get the conservative Japanese utility companies like Tokyo Gas and Tokyo Electric to commit to Russian gas for their energy future dependence. But in the end, it was successful. Today, a total of 6 Japanese utility companies have committed to long-term agreements. In addition, the Korean Gas Corporation will purchase up to 2 million tons of LNG, representing the first Russian gas to be delivered to South Korea. In late 2004, Sakhalin Energy announced a major pioneering agreement to sell LNG to an import terminal in Baja California, Mexico, which is operated by Sempra and Shell. This gas will find its way into the growing energy markets of Southern California and Northwest Mexico. And as of today, about 80% of the 2-train capacity has been sold to long-term Asia-Pacific markets, and there is currently talk about expansion to a 3rd LNG train. So why has this Sakhalin II project been successful in a difficult country like Russia? First of all, it was founded on a solid legal production sharing agreement contract with both the federal and state Russian governments, which locks in such fundamentals as government takes of production, all tax rates, and import and export duties for the life of the project. The agreement was grandfathered into Russian law in 1995 with the passage of the Russian PSA law, and the government has maintained continuous commitment that they will follow the terms of this PSA despite many internal pressures from conservative political opponents. You have to get used to in Russia, the word conservative and liberal means something different in Russia than it does here in the United States. Next has been strong partnerships. The Shell, Mitsui, and Mitsubishi partnership forming Sakhalin Energy has been solidified by previous experience on other Asia-Pacific projects, and each partner's fundamental objectives have been aligned and with the others, and the Japanese connection has certainly helped as far as delivering new gas markets and project financing. The investors have come together with the Russian government, both federal and state, through a project supervisory board to govern the project's key decisions. This partnership has been very successful in helping to clear all the approval hurdles that occur on this project in the Russian bureaucracy, plus promoting the project with new LNG customers. Shell and its partners have maintained a focus on maximizing local Russian content on their project decisions, a requirement of the PSA. In the end, more than 70% of our investment for this project will be placed with Russian enterprises and result in over 100,000 man-years of local employment in addition to the huge production shares and taxes flowing to the government. To execute a project of this complexity, it is necessary to have your project people, both expats and Russians, there living and working in country on the ground to make it happen. Russians, like anyone else, prefer not to have foreign commuters manage their natural resources. A strong vision of new commercial markets linking Sakhalin gas supplies to Japan, Korea, and other Asian countries was critical in getting this project moving forward. You might think that there is a natural fit with the geography, but there was nothing natural about building confidence with Japanese customers to make binding long-term commercial agreements for Russian energy. Much trust had to be built over many years to be successful in our sales. Next, technical project execution has been critical. Shell is only one of few operating companies in the world who can execute a project of this size and complexity. It takes the background, technical knowledge, a talented staff, including many Russians and contractors in the areas of engineering, commercial, and finance, to identify the many challenges and innovate solutions. Managing multiple simultaneous billion-dollar sub-projects and getting them all to the starting line at the same time is no small task in such an environment. Finally, it takes developing the support of all layers of the Russian government up to the very highest levels. One of the proudest moments in my career was in November 2003 when I witnessed President Vladimir Putin make a very strong sales pitch to customer countries for the Sakhalin LNG project at the annual APEC conference in Bangkok. It took a lot of continuous, painful lobbying at many levels to get that kind of support built into his speech, but in the end, I think it was well worth it. It starts by having a project that is fundamentally good for the long-term interest of Russia and consistent and supportive of the President's economic goals. So after hearing about the success case of Sakhalin, can Russia fill the energy supply gap for the world in the future? In thinking about this question, I couldn't help but remember the quote from Winston Churchill about Russia around the end of World War II. He said about Russia, "I cannot forecast the future actions of Russia. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma." While the mystery of the Iron Curtain has certainly been removed from Russia in today's world, there is still a mystery or uncertainty of its commitment and pace of reform to become an economic power in the world commensurate with its potential, particularly as an alternative energy supplier to OPEC. Let's summarize some of the key success factors for Russia's energy development to happen in line with its potential. First, massive capital investments will be required, some $900 billion over the next 25 years, as we talked about earlier. That level of spending would require a 3- to 4-fold increase in current capital spending by all Russian oil companies combined. Bottom line is that it cannot happen unless they seek outside assistance. They cannot do this internally. There must be outside help from many of the international operating companies, but also international financial lenders as well. To do this, there must be a level playing field for the foreign direct investor. Total foreign direct investment in Russia has remained constant the last few years at about $4 billion per annum, a fraction of the level we see, for instance, in China. Foreign direct investment must increase dramatically. That means holding all companies, Russian or foreign, to the same environmental, legal, and regulatory standards, such as those sponsored by the World Bank. Corporate and severance tax rates must be fair and take into consideration the required reinvestment levels by the producing companies. And to do this will require significant regulatory reform work in Russia. Russia also needs to have increased transparency in government and business. Russia must aggressively take on the issue of corrupt practices, particularly with public officials. Adoption and rigorous enforcement of international ethics and legal standards would not only help to attract investors, but also improve Russia's standing in the European and world economic communities, and also their desire to ascend to the WTO. Regulatory bureaucracy must be streamlined, particularly in permitting new projects and businesses. There must be a stable judiciary that is committed to the rule of law. The laws and regulations can be simplified greatly to eliminate conflicting statutes. Adoption of international environmental and regulatory performance standards used by Western countries where the operator must demonstrate compliance would be a major step forward, rather than the old Soviet prescriptive standards that they use today. There must be an expansion of oil and gas pipelines and export infrastructure to efficiently get the hydrocarbons to the international markets. That infrastructure will need to be open to all shippers for fair use, similar to the common carrier regulations that we have in this country. It is difficult to see such reforms happen quickly in Russia with a state-owned monopoly company currently in control. Lastly, there must be fair risk and reward schemes made available to investors that are appropriate for the nature of the projects. Traditional tax and royalty terms, which can be changed actually by the Duma, may work well for small to medium, faster payout projects that are near existing infrastructure. Shell's billion-dollar investment in the Sakhalin project in western Siberia is a good example of this. But for grassroots projects in challenging offshore or Arctic areas where the infrastructure has to be built and payout times can be 10 years or more, they don't work as well. Investors who put down billions of dollars, multi-billion-dollar bets on such project have to be assured that the terms of the game are not going to be changed after the bets are placed. PSAs with a defined process for external dispute resolution provide an excellent mechanism for providing such guarantees. Unfortunately, there have only been 3 PSAs granted in Russia's history. However, the Ministry of Natural Resources has recently shown positive signs of reconsidering PSAs. So in final summary, I think Russia can play a pivotal role in meeting the energy needs of the future. The more that Russia opens up its doors to international companies and foreign investors, that interaction will help to accelerate the pace of reform and change in Russia that must take place. Companies such as Shell can be catalysts in identifying critical projects and bringing the international technology, finances, and market associations that are so very necessary for successful execution. It is a reinforcing process that will take time and focus to resolve. I want to thank you this morning for your patience. I did not answer the question, what does this all mean for Indiana? But I hope that you will ponder some of those ideas, and then we can explore that in the breakout session this afternoon. Because I think there are opportunities, as I listen to some of the previous speakers, for Indiana business to be active in the economy of Russia, as well as the energy development in Russia going forward in the future. So, thank you very much.